Margaret Calloway had been married to Richard Calloway for 33 years when he told her, over coffee, that he was leaving and that the firm would be staying with him. Margaret Ann Calloway was 56 years old. She had co-founded Calloway & Voss Architectural Partners in 1996, the year she turned 30, with a drafting table she bought used for $40 and a business card she designed herself on a borrowed laser printer. She had not been the Voss. There had never been a Voss. Richard had suggested the second name during a dinner at a restaurant in 1995, told her that Calloway architecture sounded like one woman working out of her garage, and that a firm needed to sound like more than one person, even when it wasn't. She'd laughed and gone along with it, because at 29 she had not yet learned that the things you laugh along with at 29 sometimes calcify into the architecture of your entire life. No pun intended. She would think later, lying awake at 56, turning the joke over like a stone she couldn't put down. She had drafted the firm's first 11 projects herself, by hand, before they could afford a second computer. She had passed her architectural licensing exam on the first attempt in 1993, 3 years before Richard passed his on the second. She knew the zoning code for 4 counties well enough to recite setback requirements the way other people recited phone numbers. In 31 years of practice, she had stamped 214 sets of construction documents. She could tell, from 15 feet away, whether a roof pitch was 4 in 12 or 5 in 12, a skill she had never once been asked about, and had never once needed validated, until the morning Richard set his coffee cup down on the kitchen island they had chosen together in 2009 and told her he wanted a divorce, and that Calloway & Voss would be staying with him, because his name was on the operating agreement as managing partner in hers, due to what he called a paperwork inconsistency from the original filing, currently was not. That was the entire sentence, a paperwork inconsistency from the original filing. Margaret had been awake since 5 that morning, the way she'd been awake since 5 every morning for 31 years, because the light over the kitchen sink came through east-facing glass that she had specified herself in 1998, when they'd renovated the house, because she liked watching the sun cross the yard while she made coffee. She was still holding her own cup, untouched, when Richard said the word inconsistency, and she set it down without drinking from it, and said, "What paperwork inconsistency?" He had a manila folder. He had brought it to the kitchen table, which told her he had planned this, that this was not a thing he had decided over coffee, but a thing he had rehearsed, possibly with someone, possibly with the woman from his office, whose name Margaret did not yet know, but would know within the week. A 34-year-old office manager named Brittany Hale, who had joined the firm 18 months earlier to handle scheduling and client intake, and who had, it would turn out, handled considerably more than that. In 2003, Richard said, opening the folder, when we restructured as an LLC, the operating agreement listed me as managing member with 60% ownership. You as 40%. That's not what we agreed, Margaret said. We agreed 50-50. We've always operated as 50-50. Operated as, yes, the filed documents say 60-40. I had Calloway & Voss. There's no Voss, Richard. There was never a Voss. I had it drafted by a lawyer at the time. You signed it. I signed 16 things that year. We were finishing the Pierce Library edition and starting the Brennan House, and I signed whatever you put in front of me, because I trusted you to put the right thing in front of me. Richard didn't argue this. He didn't have to. He had the document, dated and signed, her signature on the bottom line in the handwriting she'd had at 37, a signature she recognized completely, and a clause she had never knowingly agreed to. I'm not trying to be unfair here, he said. I'm being practical. The firm has 31 employees. Payroll runs Thursday. Someone has to be making decisions while we sort out the personal side of things, and operationally, that's been me for the last several years anyway, if we're honest. It was, Margaret would reflect later, an almost reasonable thing to say. Payroll did run Thursday. 31 people did depend on it. And it was true that Richard had taken over the firm's financial management in 2018 after her mother's stroke had pulled Margaret's attention toward Pittsburgh for the better part of a year in which she had assumed, because she had no reason not to, that whatever Richard was filing on her behalf was filed the way they had always filed things, together, accurately, as equals. "Where's Brittany in all this?" Margaret said, because she had begun, in the last 90 seconds, to do arithmetic she had not done before, about company credit cards, and a conference in Scottsdale, and a haircut Richard had gotten in March, that he'd never gotten before. A haircut that cost more than haircuts he had previously considered a waste of money. Richard's jaw worked once, almost imperceptibly, the way it had worked at partner meetings when a client questioned a budget line he didn't want questioned. "That's not relevant to the ownership structure," he said. "I think it's relevant to several things," Margaret said, and stood up and left her coffee on the table, where it sat, untouched. Going cold in the morning light she had chosen for this kitchen 27 years ago. She stood in the upstairs hallway for a moment afterward, not crying, not yet. Just standing very still outside the bedroom she had shared with Richard for 33 years, doing the particular arithmetic that comes to a person in the first 10 minutes after the floor changes shape beneath them. 33 years. 214 stamped drawings. A daughter who barely called anymore, and a husband who had apparently been planning this for longer than she'd had any reason to suspect. She thought, standing there, of the 11 projects she'd drafted by hand before they could afford a second computer, the ones nobody but her remembered drawing, and felt something harden in her chest that was not yet a plan, but was, unmistakably, the early architecture of one. She drove to the office that morning out of something closer to muscle memory than decision. She had driven the same 11 minutes on Castleton Avenue for 31 years, past the Methodist church and the elementary school and the gas station that had become a Wawa in 2014. And her hands did the route without her mind's permission, while her mind did other things, mostly the arithmetic of 40%. The office occupied the second floor of a converted mill building on River Street, a building Margaret had personally identified in 1996 as undervalued, had argued the firm into leasing when Richard wanted something with better street visibility downtown, had been right about, because the mill building's exposed timber and 12-foot ceilings had become, within 5 years, exactly the kind of space that made clients believe an architecture firm understood materials. She had picked the conference table. She had picked the north-facing studio windows for the drafting bays, because north light didn't shift through the day, a fact that every architecture student learns in their second year, and that Richard, who had transferred into architecture from a business degree in his junior year of college, had needed her to explain to him in 1994. The receptionist, a 26-year-old named Dana, who had worked at the firm for 2 years and whom Margaret genuinely liked, looked up when Margaret came through the glass doors, and her face did something complicated. Not surprise exactly. More like the face of someone who has been told something and was hoping it wasn't true. "Richard wanted me to let you know," Dana said, "that your badge access has been, there's a transition happening with its services this week, so my badge doesn't work," Margaret said. "It's being updated," Dana said miserably. Margaret had founded this firm. She had stamped the drawings for the building Dana was currently sitting in. She stood in the lobby of Calloway and Voss for the length of time it took to understand, fully and without remaining doubt, that this had been planned with enough lead time to disable a key card, and she felt something that was not yet rage, because rage required more processing time than she'd had, but was the cold, organizing precursor to rage. The feeling of a person beginning, very precisely, to take inventory. "Can you tell me?" Margaret said to Dana, who's been moved into the corner office. "My corner office." "Brittany," Dana said, and then looked immediately like she regretted saying it out loud, though she had clearly been waiting for someone to ask. Margaret asked to see Richard. Dana, with the particular discomfort of a 26-year-old, asked to enforce a boundary she'd had no part in setting, told her he was in a meeting, and would be for most of the afternoon, and that he'd suggested, through Dana, not directly, which Margaret noted, that any operational questions go through the firm's general counsel, rather than to him personally for the time being. "His suggestion or hers?" Margaret asked. Dana didn't answer that one, which was its own answer. Margaret called the firm's general counsel, a man named Philip Doss, who had drafted contracts for Calloway and Voss for nearly 15 years, and who Margaret had always considered, with a naivety she would later find almost embarrassing, to be working for both of them equally. Philip's tone on the phone was careful in a specific, practiced way, the tone of a man who has already been told what he is and isn't permitted to say. "I want to be straightforward with you, Margaret," Philip said. "I represent the LLC. Not you individually, and not Richard individually, the entity. If there's a dispute about ownership percentages, that's not something I can advise you on. You'd want your own counsel." "You drafted the 2003 restructuring," Margaret said. "I did. Did you draft it knowing it said 60-40, when Richard and I had always operated as 50-50? There was a pause on the line longer than Margaret expected. "I drafted what I was instructed to draft," Philip said finally. "I'd encourage you to get your own representation, Margaret. I mean that as a kindness, not a deflection." On her way out of the building, Margaret passed the corner office, her corner office, the one she'd chosen in 1996 for its view of the river bend, and saw Brittany Hale through the glass for the first time in person, rather than as a name on a credit card statement. Brittany was 34, dressed in the kind of tailored navy that read as competence to people who hadn't yet learned to distinguish competence from costume, and she looked up when Margaret passed, holding her gaze for exactly as long as it took to communicate that she had absolutely no intention of looking away first. She did not say anything. She did not need to. She simply touched, lightly, with 2 fingers, the corner of the desk that had been Margaret's desk for 27 years, the way a person touches something to confirm, privately, that it is now theirs. Margaret kept walking. She did not go back to the office for 9 days, not because she had given up, but because she understood, in the particular way an architect understands load distribution, that walking back into a building she no longer controlled, to argue with a man holding paperwork she hadn't read closely enough 19 years ago, was a structurally unsound approach to the problem. She needed, instead, to find out what she actually owned. What she actually owned, it turned out over the course of those 9 days, sitting at her own kitchen table with a banker's box of old files and a legal pad, was considerably more interesting than 40% of a firm she could no longer enter. She found, in a fireproof box in the back of her home office closet, 3 things she had forgotten she'd kept. The original 1996 partnership agreement, handwritten and signed by both of them before any lawyer had been involved. Splitting the firm 50-50 and explicitly naming it Calloway Architecture before Richard's suggestion 6 months later. A folder of every project she had personally stamped as architect of record going back to 1996. 214 sets of drawings, her license number on every one of them, and a single sheet of paper typed on an old dot matrix printer that she had completely forgotten existed. A 1996 client services agreement she had drafted herself, before the LLC reorganization, before Voss, before any of it, stating that all client relationships and design intellectual property developed under the original sole proprietorship, meaning every client she had personally brought in or served before the 2003 restructuring, remained, in the event of dissolution, the personal property of Margaret Ann Calloway, individually, as the original and sole proprietor of record. She had drafted that document the way she drafted everything in those years, carefully, alone, at night. Because she had understood even at 30 that nobody else was going to protect her interests for her. She had not thought about it in over 2 decades. She had not needed to. Now, she sat at her kitchen table at 56 years old, reading her own 30-year-old handwriting in the margins, and felt the particular vertigo of meeting a younger, more careful version of yourself exactly when you needed her most. She called a lawyer the next morning, not the firm's lawyer. A different one. A contract specialist named Helen Pruitt, who had handled Margaret's mother's estate after the stroke, and who Margaret trusted in the specific, hard-won way you trust someone who has already seen you at your worst and didn't flinch. Helen read both documents twice. She read the 2003 LLC filing Richard had produced. She was quiet for a long moment. The particular quiet of a professional doing arithmetic she doesn't want to say out loud until she's sure of it. The 2003 document is real, Helen said finally. It's filed. It's enforceable as to firm ownership going forward. He's not lying about the 60-40 split, not anymore, not on paper. Margaret felt something in her chest go very still and very cold. But, Helen said, this 1996 client agreement predates it. And it was never superseded. Nobody dissolved it, because nobody remembered it existed. If this is what I think it is, Margaret, your original clients, and I mean the relationships, the design work, the intellectual property associated with them, never actually transferred into the LLC at all. They're sitting outside the company structure your husband currently controls. Legally, they may never have belonged to Calloway and Voss. They may have always belonged to you. How many clients are we talking about? Margaret asked, though some part of her already knew, because she had spent 9 days with a legal pad doing exactly this math. How many clients did you personally bring in before 2003? Margaret thought of the Pierce Library, the Brennan House, the Hartwell Medical Office Complex, the 11 original projects she'd drafted by hand before they could afford a second computer, and the 7 of those original clients who were still, after 30 years, calling the firm every time they needed a renovation, an addition, a permit consultation. Because they had never really been calling Calloway and Voss. They had been calling Margaret. 7, she said. Maybe 8, if the Hartwell family's still doing business under the old entity. Then I'd say, Helen said, closing the folder slowly, the way a person closes a folder when they want you to understand the gravity of what's inside it, without saying the word gravity. We have some phone calls to make before Richard finds this folder, too. Margaret left Helen's office that afternoon and drove the long way home, past the river, past the mill building she had chosen and could no longer enter, and felt, for the first time in 9 days, something that wasn't quite hope, but was hope's quieter, more practical cousin. The feeling of a person who has just discovered that the floor she thought had given out beneath her was never actually load-bearing in the first place. She did not call Richard. She did not call anyone at the firm. Instead, she drove 40 minutes north to a town called Thornfield, where her aunt had left her, 11 years earlier, a building Margaret had never once considered useful, a derelict 2-story Main Street storefront with a collapsed section of roof, a building everyone in the family had agreed, at the time, was essentially worthless, a tax liability dressed up as an inheritance, and that Margaret had kept only because it had been her aunt's. and because some part of her had never been able to sell something with that much original tin ceiling still intact. The building sat at 14 Mill Street, between a shuttered hardware store and a laundromat that had closed sometime around 2019. Its brick facade discolored by water that had been finding its way in through the roof for at least 6 years, according to the inspection report Margaret had paid for and then filed away, unread past the first page, in 2015. She parked across the street and sat in the car for 11 minutes before going in, partly because she needed the time, and partly because she was afraid, in a specific and not entirely irrational way, that walking into a ruined building was an admission that the life she'd spent 31 years building had in fact ruined along with it. The lock had not been changed since her aunt's death. The key, the same brass key Margaret had carried on her ring for 11 years without ever using it, turned with effort. But turned. The door swung inward onto a smell of standing water, old paper, and something fainter beneath it. Cedar, she would realize after a moment, coming from somewhere toward the back of the space. The front room had been a dry goods store in her aunt's time, and before that, according to the date stamped into the cornerstone outside, a hardware supplier dating to 1911. The collapsed section of roof was toward the rear, over what had once been a stockroom. An afternoon light came through the gap in a single defined column, illuminating a slow current of dust that moved when Margaret walked through it. The original tin ceiling, 12-foot, hand-pressed, the kind that cost more to reproduce today than most people's kitchen renovations, ran the length of the room. Water stained brown in patches, but otherwise, remarkably, intact. The floor was wide plank heart pine, cupped in places from decades of moisture, but solid enough that it didn't give beneath her weight. She stood in the doorway for several minutes simply looking, the way she had trained herself to look at 100 derelict properties over 31 years of practice, cataloging without yet deciding, structural members first, then envelope. Then the things that told you who had been here and what they had valued. The roof failure was contained to roughly 400 square feet at the rear. The original brick party walls, 18 inches thick by her estimate, showed no signs of bowing. Someone, her aunt, she assumed, or whoever her aunt had hired decades earlier, had reinforced the second-floor joists at some point with sistered lumber that didn't match the original framing. Careful work, done by someone who knew what they were doing. She moved deeper into the space. The stockroom, despite the roof gap directly above it, was drier than she expected. Because whoever had last used this room had built, against the back wall, a simple shed roof of their own, tucked beneath the larger collapse, enough to keep one back corner protected. Margaret stood for a moment at the threshold between the two rooms, the doorway itself slightly out of square, the way old timber-frame doorways settled over a century of seasonal movement, and noted, almost automatically, that the lintel above it was a full 8x8, oversized for a simple stockroom door, the kind of detail a person specified only if they intended the structure to outlast them. Under the improvised shelter at the back sat 4 wooden crates, their lids nailed shut, stenciled in fading black paint with a name Margaret didn't recognize. T. Calloway HDW Supply, 1947. She knelt beside the nearest crate and ran her hand along its edge before opening anything, the way she'd been trained, decades earlier, to assess before disturbing. The wood was poplar, dry despite the building's general dampness. The joints dovetailed rather than nailed at the corners. Careful work, the kind of joinery you didn't bother with for something you intended to throw away. A pry bar, rusted but usable, hung on a nail driven into the stud beside the crates, as though someone had once expected to need it and never come back to use it. The first crate held tools, hand planes, a brace, and bits set. A level with a brass-bound vial still intact and, remarkably, still reading true when she set it on the windowsill to check. The second held bolts of canvas, mouse chewed at the edges but largely sound, and a stack of order forms printed with a letterhead she didn't recognize. T. Calloway Hardware and Supply, Est, 1911. Thornfield, the third crate, when she finally worked the lid free with the rusted pry bar, released the smell that had been reaching her since she first stepped into the room. Cedar, sharp and unmistakable, from a lining someone had installed inside the crate itself. The kind of detail you only added if you cared, specifically, about what was being protected inside it. The fourth crate, near the bottom, beneath a folded canvas tarp that had kept 70 years of dust from settling directly onto the contents, held the ledgers, 41 years of them, 1911 through 1952, leather-bound and water-damaged at the edges but legible. Page after page of hardware orders, customer accounts, and, in a smaller, separate ledger near the bottom of the fourth crate, something that made Margaret sit down on an overturned crate and read for the better part of an hour without moving. A record of property holdings. Not just the Mill Street building. 3 additional parcels purchased by Thaddeus Calloway between 1923 and 1941, listed by lot number and street address, all in Thornfield, all still. As far as Margaret could immediately determine, sitting somewhere in the chain of title that had eventually, through inheritance no one had bothered to fully trace, come down to her aunt, and then to her. She did not yet know what those 3 parcels were worth. She did not yet know if her aunt had known about them, or simply inherited paperwork no one had read closely enough to understand. What she knew, sitting on an overturned hardware crate in a building with a hole in its roof, holding a ledger that smelled like cedar and someone else's careful handwriting, was that she had spent the last 9 days believing she had nothing. And that belief had been, in the specific and humiliating way that beliefs about your own worthlessness so often are, simply wrong. She came back to Thornfield 4 more times over the following 2 weeks. On her second visit, she brought a tarp and sealed off the roof gap herself, working from a borrowed ladder, because she understood structural triage in a way that made the decision automatic. Protect the envelope first, assess everything else after. On her third visit, she met Walter Pruitt, a retired Thornfield High School history teacher who had spent 40 years cataloging the town's old commercial buildings as the Historical Society's unpaid, unofficial archivist, and who turned out to know more about the building's history than the deed records did. Her aunt's maiden name had been Calloway. Margaret's married name was also Calloway, a coincidence she had never once considered worth examining, because Calloway was not, in this part of the state, a particularly rare name, and because she had spent 31 years assuming her own name belonged to Richard's family more than her own, simply because she had taken it the way you take a name at 23 without doing the genealogy on it. Walter was the one who finally connected it for her. T. Calloway, stenciled on those crates, had been her own great-grandfather, Thaddeus Calloway, who had run a hardware supply business out of this exact storefront from 1911 until his death in 1952. The same Calloway line that had, 3 generations later, and through a series of small, undramatic choices, produced Margaret's father, and then Margaret, and then a marriage in which Margaret's own name had been treated, by everyone including herself, as something she'd acquired rather than something she'd always carried. Your great-grandfather, Walter said, wasn't just selling hardware. In the 20s and 30s, half the buildings on this block were going up using lumber and fittings he'd sourced, and in some cases personally specified. He understood construction better than half the contractors working this county at the time. There's a reason this building's still standing after a roof failure that would have taken down half the storefronts on this street. He overbuilt it. 18-inch party walls in a one-story hardware store. Nobody does that unless they know something the building inspector doesn't. What about the other 3 parcels? Margaret said. The ones in the second ledger. Walter's face did something careful. You found those. I found those. One of them, he said, is the old rail spur lot, 2 blocks east. The other 2 are commercial lots on Front Street, right along the river. I don't know what they're zoned for now, but I know that the town's been talking, on and off for about 6 years, about a riverfront redevelopment district. If your great-grandfather's parcels sit inside that district boundary, and I believe at least 2 of them do, that's not nothing, Margaret. That's not nothing at all. It was, Margaret thought, looking up at her own family's tin ceiling, the first time in 3 weeks that anyone had said her name without it being attached, in some way, to a thing she had lost. She did not tell Richard any of this. She did not tell Brittany Hale, whose name she now knew completely, along with several other things about the 18 months prior that she had pieced together from Dana's careful, increasingly unguarded text messages. The Scottsdale conference, the haircut, a company credit card statement Dana had, with visible nervousness, forwarded to Margaret's personal email, in case it's useful. Which it was, because it documented in itemized restaurant charges and a 4-night stay at a resort that had nothing to do with any conference Margaret had ever heard of, the shape of exactly what Richard had been managing, operationally for the past several years, while he told her she'd been the one not paying attention. What Margaret decided to do, sitting in Helen Pruitt's office on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the divorce announcement, was simple and required nothing from Richard at all. The 7 original clients, Helen said, the ones from before the 2003 restructuring. I've drafted letters to each of them, on your letterhead, your original letterhead, Margaret Calloway. Architect, the name you used before Voss ever existed. The letters informed them, accurately and without editorializing, that the 1996 services agreement under which their original relationship was established was never superseded, and that going forward, you are available to continue their architectural services directly under your original license. Is that legal? Margaret asked, though she had already read the document 11 times and knew the answer. It's not just legal, Helen said. It's true. Richard can keep the LLC. He can keep the office on River Street and the 31 employees and Brittany Hale, God help him. But the firm's actual reputation, the design relationships, the work that made Calloway and Voss worth anything to a client in the first place, that was never really inside the LLC at all. It was inside you. He spent 2 decades building a company on top of a foundation he never legally owned, and he doesn't appear to know it. Margaret thought about her great-grandfather's 18-inch party walls, built deeper and stronger than anyone had asked him to build them, in a building everyone else considered a simple hardware store. Send the letters, she said. The first reply came within 36 hours. It was from Edward Hartwell, 81 years old, whose family's medical office complex Margaret had designed in 1999 and whose 3 children had in the years since. Each called her personally for additions, garages, and one memorable boathouse, never once going through the firm's general intake line because, as Edward put it on the phone, we don't call Calloway and Voss, Margaret, we call you. We've always called you. He had 3 more projects in mind for the coming year, he said, and he'd be glad to sign whatever paperwork made it official that he was working with her directly. By the end of the week, 5 of the 7 had responded, all in some version of the same register, relief, mixed with a faint, unspoken embarrassment that they hadn't realized, until the letter arrived, that there had ever been any question about who they were actually working with. If you've made it this far into Margaret Calloway's story, hit subscribe, because what happens next is the part I've been waiting to tell you. Her daughter called that same week, the first time in 11 months. Claire was 31, lived 4 hours away outside Pittsburgh, and had stopped speaking to Margaret with any regularity 2 years earlier, after a Thanksgiving argument neither of them had ever fully resolved, the specifics of which had less to do with the divorce than with a decade of Margaret being, by her own private admission, more present at the office than at home during the years that had mattered most. Claire had heard about the divorce from Margaret's sister, not from Margaret, which had been its own kind of wound, the discovery that her daughter's first information about the dissolution of her 33-year marriage had come secondhand. "I heard about Dad and the firm," Claire said, with the careful neutrality of someone who had rehearsed the opening lines several times. "Are you okay?" "I'm managing," Margaret said, which was true, though not the whole truth, and she could hear Claire deciding whether to push past it. "I always thought it was your firm," Claire said. "Growing up, I never understood why it had 2 names. Margaret did not tell her about the letters, or the ledgers, or the building in Thornfield, not yet. Not because she didn't want to, but because some of it still felt too new and too uncertain to risk saying out loud to someone whose good opinion she had spent 2 years afraid she'd lost permanently. "It's a long story," Margaret said instead. "I'd like to tell you the whole thing sometime. In person, maybe." There was a pause on the line, the kind that could have gone either direction. "I could come down some weekend," Claire said finally. "If you'd want that." "I'd want that," Margaret said, and meant it more than the 4 words could carry, and did not say anything further, because she had learned in the last several weeks that the sentences that mattered most were often the ones you didn't need to decorate. The 6th client, a contractor named Soo-Jin Park, who had built 4 of Margaret's residential designs over the years and trusted her enough to skip blueprints entirely on small change orders, called Margaret directly instead of replying to the letter. "I've got a job starting in Thornfield in about 2 months," Soo-Jin said. "Riverfront mixed use, small scale, 8 units over retail. You know that area at all?" "I might know it better than you'd think," Margaret said, and looked out the window of her kitchen, toward the river she could not see from her house, but had begun, in the last several weeks, to think about constantly. She spent the next 4 months doing 2 things simultaneously, the way she had once worked the Pierce Library and the Brennan House in the same season, decades earlier, before either project mattered as much as either felt like it did at the time, stabilizing 14 Mill Street, room by room, and quietly rebuilding a client list that had, it turned out, never actually belonged to anyone but her. The roof came first. She hired a structural engineer out of her own pocket, a careful, soft-spoken man named Felix Adeyemi, who had done inspection work for her on 3 prior projects, and who walked the building for 2 hours before telling her what she'd already suspected. The original framing, where it survived, was overbuilt by a margin that modern code would consider almost wasteful. 4x6 rafters on 16-inch centers, where current code permitted 2x8s on 24. Whoever framed this in 1911 didn't trust anybody, Felix said, including the building inspector of 1911. The repair, where needed, could match the original specification rather than replace it with something lighter, which would cost more up front and save Margaret, Felix estimated, at least 30 years of future maintenance. She paid $34,200 for the roof structure alone, drawing against a home equity line she'd taken out in her own name, a name that, as of the divorce filing now moving through Helen Pruitt's office, was reverting fully to Calloway, no hyphen, no Richard surname trailing after it the way it had for 31 years. The roofing contractor, a man named Desmond Reyes, who'd worked on 6 of Margaret's restoration projects over the years, and who recognized her handwriting on the original specification sheet before he recognized her face, finished the structural work in 11 days, and the standing seam metal roofing, chosen, Margaret specified, in a weathered zinc gray that would read as original rather than new, in another 6. The first week of March brought a hard, late frost that put the roofing schedule 3 days behind, and Margaret spent those 3 days inside the building instead, doing the slower, less visible work of going through what remained of the structure, room by room, with a moisture meter and a notepad. The way she'd been trained to assess any building before deciding what it was actually worth saving. The original wainscoting in the front room, she discovered, was chestnut, American chestnut, the kind that hadn't been commercially available since the blight wiped out the species in the 1930s and 1940s, meaning the wood lining the lower 3 feet of her great-grandfather's hardware store was, in a quiet and entirely practical way, irreplaceable. She had it carefully removed, panel by panel, cleaned, and reinstalled rather than replaced, a decision that cost an additional $6,400 in skilled labor and that she did not hesitate over for even a moment. She spent the long, slow center of that spring doing the work she had always done best and had somehow, for 3 decades, allowed herself to believe was secondary to the work of running a firm. She drew. She sat at a drafting table she'd bought, used, for the second time in her life. This one a 1970s Mayline she found at an estate sale in Thornfield for $180. And she drew the building back into a version of itself that honored what Thaddeus Calloway had built, without pretending the intervening 70 years hadn't happened. The front room became her own studio, the original tin ceiling cleaned and patched rather than replaced. The heart pine floors sanded, but not refinished glossy, left with enough texture that you could still read the building's age in the grain. The rear stockroom, where the 4 ledger crates had sat for who knew how many decades, became a small conference space. The new structural members left exposed and stained to match the old, a deliberate seam between then and now rather than a disguise. She hung, in the front window facing Mill Street, a single brass plaque, the kind she'd had made exactly once before, in 1996. Before Voss, before any of it, Margaret Calloway, architect, underneath, in smaller lettering, established 1996. She had debated, briefly, whether to note the building's older history, Calloway Hardware Supply, established 1911, and decided against it, not because it wasn't true, but because she wanted the plaque to say something simpler, that she had started this once, and she was starting it again, in a building that, as it turned out, had been quietly waiting for her the whole time. Walter Pruitt became, over those 4 months, something closer to a partner than Margaret had expected when she'd first met him examining her tin ceiling with the careful hunger of a man who'd worried it might be lost. He came by the building 2 or 3 times a week, ostensibly to consult on the historical accuracy of the restoration, and stayed. More often than not, for 2 hours longer than the consultation required, the 2 of them working through the ledgers together at the conference table in the old stockroom. Walter narrating the town's history in a way that made the 3 undeveloped parcels, the rail spur lot, the 2 Front Street properties, feel less like an inheritance and more like a debt finally being honored. There was a morning in late March, while the roofing crew was still finishing the standing seam work overhead, when Walter brought a county plat map from 1938 and spread it across the conference table next to the 4th ledger crate, the one Margaret had not yet finished cataloging. "Your great-grandfather," Walter said, tracing a finger along a parcel boundary, bought the rail spur lot the same month the spur itself was decommissioned. Most people would call that bad timing. I think he knew the rail company would need to sell off the right-of-way eventually, and he wanted to be the one person in town already holding adjacent land when they did. "You're saying he was patient," Margaret said. I'm saying he understood that worthless and undervalued aren't the same thing, and most people never bother learning the difference. Walter looked up at her, briefly, in a way that made Margaret suspect he wasn't only talking about the rail spur lot. Man built this whole building assuming someone, eventually, would need it to still be standing. Doesn't seem like the kind of person who'd mind waiting 90 years for the right someone to show up. It was Walter who pushed the riverfront question past speculation. He drove Margaret to a town council meeting in April, the kind of sparsely attended Tuesday evening session where most of Thornfield's actual governing happened, and sat beside her while a planning consultant from the Regional Development Authority presented a draft map of the proposed riverfront redevelopment district. A map that, when Margaret finally got close enough to read the parcel boundaries, included both Front Street lots entirely and roughly 60% of the old rail spur property. "I need an appraisal," Margaret told Helen the next morning, "a real one. Not what my aunt's estate paperwork said in 2015, current market value, with the redevelopment district factored in if it's defensible." Helen recommended a commercial appraiser named Donna Castellano, who had handled valuations for 3 other redevelopment-adjacent parcels in the county, and who, Helen noted dryly, doesn't pad numbers for anybody, which is exactly what you want right now. Donna spent 2 full days in Thornfield, walking all 4 parcels, pulling comparable sales going back 6 years, cross-referencing the draft redevelopment boundary against the county's most recent zoning amendments before she would commit to a number, a level of caution Margaret recognized and respected, because it was the same caution she brought to her own structural assessments. The appraisal took 3 weeks. The number, when it came back, was $612,000 for the 2 Front Street parcels combined, and a further $340,000 for the rail spur lot. Contingent on a zoning variance, Walter assured her the town council was likely to approve within the year, given how badly Thornfield wanted the redevelopment district to succeed. Combined with the Mill Street building itself, now appraised, post-restoration, at $295,000, against the $34,200 she'd spent on the roof and a further $19,800 on the studio build-out, plus the $6,400 chestnut wainscoting restoration, Margaret's essentially worthless inheritance had become, over the course of one spring, an asset base just shy of $1.25 million, sitting entirely outside any structure Richard Calloway had ever had access to, or even known existed. She did not call him with the number. She did not call him at all. What she did, instead, was the work, the actual, daily, hands-on work of an architect with a growing client list and a building she had built, this time on her own terms. By June, 4 of the original 7 clients had moved their active projects to Margaret Calloway, architect, formally, on new contracts Helen had drafted with language specific enough that no future paperwork inconsistency could ever again separate Margaret from work she had personally done. So, Gin Park's riverfront mixed-use project broke ground in May. 8 units over retail, 2 blocks from Margaret's own restored storefront, designed by Margaret herself, on a site she now understood, with a clarity that still occasionally stopped her mid-sentence. Sat inside a redevelopment district her own great-grandfather had apparently anticipated by 90 years. The park project gave her the first real test of whether her solo practice could actually carry a commercial-scale job, and she met it the way she'd always met that kind of test, by over-preparing past the point most architects would consider necessary. She ran the unit mix through 4 iterations before settling on the final layout, walked the site at 3 different times of day to confirm her sun angle assumptions for the south-facing units, and personally drove out to 2 comparable mixed-use buildings 40 minutes away to photograph stair details she wanted to specify correctly rather than approximate. So Gin, watching her cross-check a structural detail against the engineer's calculations for the second time in one meeting, finally said, You know I trust you, right? You don't have to triple-check everything in front of me. I'm not checking it for you, Margaret said. I'm checking it because if I get it wrong, it's wrong in concrete. And concrete doesn't care whose name is on the drawing. Richard, meanwhile, remained as far as Dana's increasingly frequent, increasingly candid updates indicated, entirely unaware that anything beyond an unpleasant but manageable divorce was occurring. He had told the remaining staff at Calloway and Voss that Margaret was stepping back to focus on some personal projects, a phrase Dana relayed with an eye roll Margaret could practically hear through the text message. He had promoted Brittany Hale to Director of Client Relations in March, a title with no clear function at a firm whose actual client relationships were, one by one, walking out the door behind letters Brittany had never been shown. He had, according to Dana, mentioned Margaret's name exactly twice in 4 months, both times in the context of explaining to a confused new client why the name on the building no longer matched the person who used to answer the phone. He thinks he won, Dana texted Margaret in late June, with a string of punctuation that conveyed, more efficiently than words could have, her opinion of that assessment. Margaret, standing in her own studio on Mill Street, surrounded by drawings for 3 new projects and a tin ceiling her great-grandfather had installed 70 years before she was born, did not correct her. There was a setback in early July that Margaret would later describe to Helen as the moment she understood she'd actually rebuilt something, rather than simply salvaged it. Edward Hartwell's youngest son, pursuing a commercial expansion of the family's medical office complex, needed a variance from the county zoning board, the kind of routine procedural hurdle Margaret had cleared a dozen times over the years as Calloway and Voss, except that this time, the zoning board's administrative assistant, working from an outdated firm directory, sent the hearing notice to Richard's office instead of Margaret's, and Richard, recognizing the Hartwell name, and apparently deciding that any opportunity to remind the county that Calloway and Voss still existed was worth taking, showed up to the hearing himself, uninvited, and attempted to present himself as the architect of record. Margaret found out only because Edward Hartwell called her, irritated, 20 minutes before the hearing started. She drove to the county building doing the kind of fast, controlled driving she hadn't done since her own children, now grown, were small enough to need an emergency room at 2 a.m, and walked into the hearing room 4 minutes before it began, holding a folder with the original Hartwell project drawings, her stamp, her license number, and a letter drafted, at her request, by Helen 2 weeks earlier, in anticipation of exactly this kind of overreach, formally notifying the county that all architectural services for Hartwell Medical were being provided by Margaret Calloway, architect, under a contract that predated and superseded any prior firm affiliation. Richard was already seated at the small table at the front of the hearing room, in the navy suit he wore for situations he wanted to look effortless in, when Margaret walked in. She watched him see her. She watched the particular, specific moment when his face recalculated, not surprise exactly. Because surprise would have required him to have been paying enough attention to her in the preceding months to be surprised. But something closer to a man checking his math and finding it didn't add up the way he'd assumed. The hearing room smelled of old carpet and the particular fluorescent hum of municipal buildings everywhere, 6 folding chairs along the back wall, and a county seal mounted slightly off-center above the dais. A detail Margaret had noticed and quietly resented on every one of the dozen or so hearings she'd attended in this room over 31 years. The zoning board chair, a heavy-set man named Russo, who had approved or denied roughly half of Calloway and Voss's variance requests over the years, glanced up from his agenda sheet at the sound of the door, registered Margaret's arrival with mild surprise, and said nothing, waiting to see how this would unfold before committing to a reaction. "Margaret," Richard said, "I wasn't aware you'd be attending. "I'm the architect of record," Margaret said, and sat down across the aisle from him and said nothing further, because Helen's letter, now in the zoning board's hands, was already saying everything that needed saying. The board granted the variance to Margaret's submission. Richard left the building 9 minutes later without speaking to her again, and Edward Hartwell, walking Margaret to her car afterward, said only, "I don't know what's going on with you two, and I don't need to. I just need my permit." "Which you got me." It was, Margaret thought, driving back to Thornfield that evening with the windows down for the first time that summer, the most honest review of her professional value she'd received in over a decade. By August, the work at 14 Mill Street had settled into something that no longer felt like restoration, and it started to feel, simply, like a practice. The daily rhythm of a small architecture office with 4 active residential projects, 2 commercial consultations, and a waiting list, a thing Calloway and Voss had not had in years, that Margaret Calloway, architect, now did. Felix Adeyemi's structural work on the rail spur lot's eventual development had moved from speculation to schematic. The zoning variance Walter had predicted in April cleared the county board in late July, adding the projected $340,000 to an asset base that had, by Helen's most recent accounting, crossed $1. $4 million once Sujin Park's completed riverfront units were factored at their finished appraisal rather than their raw land value. Margaret hired her first employee in September, a 26-year-old draftsperson named Priya Coelho, recently licensed, who had worked 2 summers at Calloway and Voss as an intern years earlier, and who told Margaret, on her first day, that she'd taken the job specifically because everyone who actually worked under you left when you did. Nobody who worked under Richard stayed for the architecture. Margaret gave her the desk nearest the north-facing windows, the good light, the kind of light Margaret herself had fought for in 1996 and had no intention of hoarding now. Priya brought with her a habit Margaret hadn't expected to find useful so quickly: a meticulous, almost compulsive practice of photographing every stage of a project's construction, which meant that by late September, the Mill Street studio had a growing wall of progress photographs documenting not just the firm's active client work, but the building's own restoration. The exposed chestnut wainscoting mid-cleaning, the new roof structure before the metal panels went on, the 4 hardware crates as Walter had first catalogued them, lids still nailed shut. Margaret found herself, more than once, standing in front of that wall at the end of a long day, looking at the photograph of her own hands prying open the first crate back in February, and feeling something she didn't entirely have language for yet, except that it resembled the particular satisfaction of watching a structural drawing become an actual, weight-bearing wall. Claire visited on the first weekend of September, 4 hours each way, and Margaret gave her the full tour of 14 Mill Street the way she might once have walked a prospective client through a finished project. Though this, she recognized partway through, mattered considerably more than any client walkthrough she'd given in 31 years. She showed Claire the tin ceiling, the chestnut wainscoting, the framed ledgers near the entrance, the 4 crates now empty and repurposed as plant stands beneath the front windows. She told her, finally, the whole story: the manila folder, the disabled badge, the 1996 client agreement she'd forgotten she'd drafted, Thaddeus Calloway's 18-inch party walls, and watched her daughter's face move through something that looked, by the end, less like surprise and more like recognition. "This is more you than the other place ever was," Claire said, standing in the studio, with her hand resting on the drafting table Margaret had bought for $180. "I don't think I ever saw the other office. Not really. I just saw you leaving for it." "I know," Margaret said. "I'm sorry for that." Claire didn't say it was fine, because it wasn't entirely fine, and Margaret had learned enough in the last several months not to want the easy version of that sentence. What Claire said instead was, "Can I come back for the park building opening? I'd like to see what you actually do." All the way through. "This time, I'd like that very much," Margaret said. And the sentence held, this time, all the weight it had been missing the first time she'd said something similar, back in February, over the phone, to a daughter she'd been afraid she'd lost the chance to say it to at all. The first frost of autumn came in mid-October, 3 days before Richard's visit, and Margaret spent that week finishing the schematic design for the Hartwell expansion, 11 sheets, hand-checked twice, the way she'd checked every set of drawings for 31 years, while Walter worked through the deed history on the third rail spur parcel at the conference table behind her. The two of them moving through the quiet, productive rhythm that had become, without either of them naming it as such, the actual daily shape of Margaret's new practice. She thought, some mornings, about the manila folder Richard had brought to the kitchen table in February, and the word he'd used, inconsistency, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only in retrospect, that he had been telling the truth without knowing it. There had been an inconsistency. It simply hadn't been the one he meant. Richard came to Thornfield in October, on a Wednesday, 6 days after Soo Jin Park's riverfront project held its open house, an event that had run a feature in the regional business paper, complete with a photograph of the finished building and a photograph, beneath it, of Margaret Calloway, architect, standing in front of her own restored storefront 2 blocks away, the brass plaque visible over her shoulder. Dana had texted Margaret the article before Margaret had even seen it printed. He's seen it. He came into the office and didn't say anything for like 10 minutes. Then, he asked Brittany if she knew the address. The studio that afternoon smelled faintly of cedar and fresh-cut pine shavings. Priya had been sanding a model of the Hartwell expansion at her desk all morning, and the low October light came through the front windows at the particular slant Margaret had specified the building for, catching the tin ceiling and throwing soft gold rectangles across the heart pine floor. Margaret was at her own drafting table, checking dimension strings on a section detail, when she heard a car slow on Mill Street and glanced up in time to see Richard's sedan ease into a parking space across from the building. He parked across the street from 14 Mill Street the way Margaret had parked there herself. 8 months earlier, the first time she'd come to look at a building everyone had told her was worthless. He sat in the car for what Priya, working at the desk by the north windows, estimated afterward to be nearly 5 minutes, before he finally crossed the street. He stopped on the sidewalk before he reached the door. Margaret, inside, watched him take in the facade, the repointed brick, the new zinc-gray roofline visible above it, the brass plaque catching the afternoon light, the tin ceiling glowing faintly through the front glass, and she watched the particular stillness that came over him, the stillness of a man recalculating a number he'd assumed was fixed. He came inside. The bell over the door, original to the building, rang once. He stood just past the threshold for a long moment, looking at the studio, the drafting tables, the 4 active project boards pinned along the exposed brick, Priya at her desk, the conference room visible through the open doorway to the old stockroom, the new structural beams stained to match the old. He did not say anything immediately. His jaw worked once, the way it had worked at the kitchen table in February, the way it had worked. Margaret now understood, every time a fact arrived that he hadn't authored himself. "This is the building from your aunt," he said finally. It wasn't quite a question. "It is," Margaret said. "You did all this." Also not quite a question. "I did." He looked around the room once more, the project boards, the ledgers from the old hardware crates, now framed and hung near the entrance as a kind of provenance display. the brass plaque visible through the front window from the inside. "I heard about the park project," he said. "I didn't realize it was. I didn't connect it to this." "There wasn't a reason for you to," Margaret said. "You weren't looking." Margaret, he took a step further into the room, and for a moment she thought he was going to reach for something conciliatory, the kind of thing he was good at saying to clients when a budget conversation went sideways. "The firm's had a rough quarter. 2 of the Hartwell projects. The park bid we lost. Brittany thinks we need to revisit the partnership structure. I came to ask if you'd consider." "No," Margaret said. It was 4 words shorter than what she might have said 6 months earlier, and she felt the difference in her own chest as she said it. Not triumph exactly, nothing so loud as that, but the specific, settled quiet of a sentence that didn't need anything added to it. Richard stood in the studio for another moment, looking less at Margaret now than at the room itself, at the evidence of a practice rebuilt entirely without him, on a foundation he had never known existed, and could not, even now, fully account for. "The 2003 filing," he said slowly. "The 60/40. I had a lawyer draft that, because I thought—" He stopped. "You thought it would matter," Margaret said. "It did. It just didn't matter the way you thought it would." He didn't ask what she meant. Margaret suspected, watching him, that some part of him had already done the arithmetic on the drive home and simply hadn't wanted it confirmed out loud. He looked at Priya, who did not look up from her drafting table. He looked once more at the brass plaque through the glass. Margaret Calloway, architect, established 1996, and at whatever calculation was happening behind his face. And then he said, "I should let you get back to it," and left. And the bell over the door rang once more behind him, and Margaret watched him cross the street and sit in his car for a long moment before driving away, and did not feel the need to watch any longer than that. Her phone buzzed 20 minutes later. "Claire, heard from Grandma you're doing the park building opening in November. Can I bring someone?" Margaret looked at the message for a moment, standing in the quiet studio, and typed back, "Yes, I'd like that. Bring whoever you want." She set the phone down on the drafting table, next to the section detail she'd been checking before Richard's car had slowed on Mill Street, and went back to work. Walter came by that evening, as he often did on Wednesdays, with a thermos of coffee and a folder of deed research he'd been chasing on the 3rd rail spur parcel. He found Margaret in the stockroom, at the conference table built from the same wood as the original framing, going through Priya's drawings for the Hartwell expansion under the light of a single drafting lamp, the rest of the studio dark behind her, the tin ceiling catching what was left of the evening through the front windows. "Heard you had a visitor," Walter said, setting the thermos down. "I did. How'd that go?" Margaret considered the question for a moment, looking up at the ceiling her great-grandfather had installed 70 years before she was born, still holding, still solid, water-stained in places but never once close to coming down. "It went fine," she said. "I had work to get back to." She poured 2 cups from the thermos, and they sat at the table together while she finished marking up the Hartwell drawings, the old ledgers framed and hung near the entrance where the evening light caught their cracked leather spines, the brass plaque visible through the front glass to anyone passing on Mill Street, lit now from inside, Margaret Calloway, architect. Established 1996, the tin ceiling holding the last of the light the way it had held it for over a century.